The divorce papers came through on a Thursday morning, an ordinary Thursday. The kind where I was drinking coffee in my new apartment, still unpacking boxes. I didn't have the energy to open and wondering what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. And I remember the light coming through the window at a low angle the way it does in late fall. I remember the sound of the coffee maker sputtering in the kitchen, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before in a different kitchen in a different life. And I remember looking down at the papers in my hands and feeling something inside me go completely, permanently still. My name is Rachel Park, I'm 34 years old, and I was the one who ruined my marriage. I met Ethan when I was 26. I was working at a small marketing firm in the city, trying to make a name for myself in a world that didn't always take young women seriously. And he was an architect brought in to consult on a project my firm was handling. And I remember the first time I saw him standing in the conference room, explaining his design with quiet confidence. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, and he wasn't the most charismatic, but there was something about him that made you want to listen. Something steady, something solid. And I fell for him slowly, the way you fall into a comfortable rhythm. We started dating, and then we were serious, and then we were engaged, and then we were married. And it all happened the way things are supposed to happen, the way you expect them to happen when you're young and hopeful, and you believe in the kind of love that lasts. I thought we were happy. For the first 4 years, I really believed we were happy. We bought a house together, a small bungalow with a big backyard, the kind of place where you could imagine raising children someday. Of yellow. We painted the living room a warm shade of placement and hosted dinner parties that stretched late into the night. We were the kind of couple that other couples looked at and thought they have it figured out, and I look back on those years now and I wonder if I was deluding myself. I wonder if the cracks were always there, and I just refused to see them. Because Ethan was always quiet, even in the early years, always a little reserved. He'd never been the kind of man who wore his heart on his sleeve. But I told myself that was part of his appeal. He was steady, he was reliable, he didn't make grand gestures, but he showed up day after day, and that was what mattered. Except somewhere around year 5, something shifted. It wasn't sudden, not really. It was slow, the way a crack in a foundation spreads before anyone's notices. Ethan started coming home later. He'd eat dinner in silence and answer my questions with one-word responses and retreat to his study and work until I'd already fallen asleep. The man who used to hold my hand while we watched TV now sat on the other end of the couch with his eyes fixed on his laptop. And I tried to talk to him. I tried the gentle approach and the direct approach and the tearful approach. I tried asking him what was wrong and what I'd done and what I could do differently, but nothing reached him. He'd pat my hand and say, "It's just work, Rachel. I'm stressed. It'll pass." And I'd believe him because the alternative was too painful to consider. The alternative was that he didn't love me anymore. The alternative was that I'd done something wrong, something I couldn't fix. The alternative was that our marriage was dying, and I was the only one who hadn't noticed. I started to feel invisible. I'd stand in front of him in a new dress, and he wouldn't look up from his laptop. I'd plan weekend getaways, and he'd cancel at the last minute, citing deadlines I couldn't verify. I'd reach for his hand in bed, and he'd turn over to face the wall. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and I'd wonder what was wrong with me, what I'd done to deserve this, what I could possibly do to make it right. And I told myself it was my fault. I wasn't pretty enough anymore, or interesting enough, or I was too needy and too demanding and too much. I started to resent him for making me feel that way, and I started to resent myself for letting him, and when resentment builds, it finds a way out. The way out came in the form of a man named Julian. I met him at a work event. It was a networking dinner, the kind of thing I usually dreaded, filled with awkward small talk and people trying to sell you things you didn't need. I was standing by the bar, nursing a glass of wine I didn't really want, when he walked up and introduced himself. He was a client, one of the bigger accounts my firm handled. He was confident and warm, the kind of man who made eye contact when you spoke and remembered the small details you'd mentioned in passing. He asked about my work and my weekend plans and the book I was reading, and he actually listened to my answers, which was more than I could say for most people at those events. And I didn't think anything of it at first. It was just a conversation, just a pleasant exchange between two people who happened to be standing in the same place at the same time. But then he started showing up at my office more often. He'd find excuses to drop by and to chat and to ask my opinion on things he could easily have asked someone else. And I found myself looking forward to his visits in a way that made me uncomfortable. He made me feel seen again. He made me feel wanted. He made me feel like I wasn't invisible, and I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was just enjoying the attention, and that it didn't mean anything, and that I would never actually act on it. But I was lying to myself, and I knew it. The emotional intimacy I was building with Julian was already a betrayal of everything I'd promised Ethan on our wedding day. And it became physical one night in late October. Julian and I had been working late on a presentation, and one thing led to another in a way I'd told myself I wouldn't let happen. And I went home that night and looked at Ethan sleeping in our bed, and I felt something inside me crack open, shame and guilt and a desperate desire to rewind time and undo everything I'd just done. I told myself I would end it. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment that I could bury and never speak of again. But I didn't end it. I kept telling myself I would, and kept finding reasons to delay, and kept drifting further into a double life that I was building with terrifying precision. Because Julian was everything Ethan wasn't. He was attentive and expressive, and he told me I was beautiful and smart, and that I deserved to be happy. He made me feel like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. And I let myself believe it, even though I knew it was wrong. The affair went on for 4 months of lies and secret phone calls, and coming home late and telling Ethan I'd been working. 4 months of feeling alive and guilty and sick with myself all at once. 4 months of pretending I wasn't destroying everything I'd ever built. And I knew it would end badly. I knew it couldn't last. But I couldn't stop myself. I was like a drowning person gasping for air, and Julian was the only thing that made me feel like I could breathe. Ethan found out to most people find out through a text message I'd forgotten to delete. He came home early one evening unexpectedly, the way things always happen when you least expect them. And I remember the light coming through the window at a low angle, the way it does in late fall. I remember the sound of his keys in the door earlier than usual. I remember the look on his face as he held up my phone like it was evidence in a crime scene, and he asked, "Who is Julian?" His voice eerily calm, and that was the worst part, the calm. And I couldn't lie, I couldn't even try. I just stood there frozen, with my bare feet on the kitchen floor, watching the man I'd married slowly realize that the person he'd trusted most in the world had betrayed him. And I said, "Ethan, please, I can explain." He said, "You don't need to explain. I understand everything I need to understand." And he didn't scream, and he didn't cry. He just walked into the bedroom and started packing a bag. And I followed him. I stood in the doorway trying to find words that didn't exist, trying to find a way to undo what I'd done. But there were no words, and there was no way. When he came back out with his suitcase in hand, he looked at me with eyes that held no anger, just a quiet, devastating disappointment. The kind that cuts deeper than any scream ever could. And he said, "I'll stay with my mother for a while. We can figure out the rest later." And he left that night. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and the taillights disappearing down the street, and I felt something inside me crack open. Not break, not yet just crack. A fissure that would eventually split me in two. And he filed for divorce 3 weeks later. He never asked me why, and he never demanded an explanation, and he never gave me a chance to apologize. He just ended it, cleanly and efficiently, the way an architect demolishes a building that can't be saved. And I didn't fight it, because I didn't deserve to. The weeks after Ethan left were the hardest of my life. I'd never felt so alone, not even in the lonely years of our marriage, because at least then he was physically present. At least then there was someone else in the house to share the silence with, even if we weren't really sharing anything else. But now I was truly alone. I'd moved into a small apartment across town, a place I couldn't afford but couldn't bear to leave, and the walls were bare, and the furniture was sparse, and everything I owned fit into a handful of boxes that I still hadn't unpacked. And I spent most of my evenings on the floor, surrounded by those boxes, replaying every moment of my marriage in my head. All the conversations I'd tried to have, and all the walls I'd tried to break through, and all the times I'd felt like I was talking to a stranger who wore my husband's face. And I tried to understand where it had all gone wrong and what I could have done differently and what I'd missed. I thought about Julian too, the affair that had destroyed everything, the man I'd risked my marriage for. The moment I realized he wasn't worth it and that none of it was worth it and that I'd thrown away something precious for something that turned out to be hollow. And we'd stopped seeing each other the night Ethan found out. It wasn't a choice, it was just over. And Julian had called me once, maybe twice, and when I didn't answer, he'd stopped calling. And I didn't blame him, I didn't blame anyone but myself, and I stopped going out, and I stopped answering my phone, and I stopped doing anything that required me to pretend I was okay. The only person I talked to was my therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patterson, who listened to me with patience I didn't deserve, and she told me I was grieving my marriage and my sense of self and the future I'd imagined. She told me it would get better and that it always does. And I wanted to believe her. I really did. But grief doesn't follow a timeline, and it doesn't care about your plans. It comes in waves, some small and manageable, others so large they threaten to pull you under, and I'd be fine one moment. And then I'd see something that reminded me of Ethan, and I'd fall apart all over again. A song we used to listen to, or a restaurant we used to go to, or the smell of his cologne on an old jacket I'd forgotten to return. And I missed him. I missed the person he used to be, and the person I'd fallen in love with. I missed the way he used to hold my hand and the way he used to look at me like I was the center of his world. I missed the years before the distance and before the silence and before everything fell apart. But I also hated him. I hated him for pushing me away and for making me feel invisible and for forcing me to choose between loneliness and betrayal. And I hated myself for hating him because I knew I had no right. I was the one who'd cheated, and I was the one who'd broken our vows, and I was the one who'd destroyed our marriage. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning, an ordinary Thursday. The kind where I was drinking coffee in my new apartment, still unpacking boxes I didn't have the energy to open, and wondering what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. And I spent the weekend in a fog, alternating between crying and staring at the ceiling, and wondering how I'd become the villain in my own story. I thought about Ethan constantly. I thought about the early years when we were happy, when he'd hold my hand and tell me he loved me. I thought about the slow drift and the distance I'd never been able to bridge. I thought about Julian and the way he'd made me feel alive, and the way that feeling had faded the moment Ethan found out. And I thought about all the things I'd never said, all the things I'd never had the courage to ask. Why did you stop loving me? And why did you push me away? And why did you make me feel like I was never enough? I'd never asked Ethan any of those questions. I'd been too afraid of the answers, and now it was too late. The marriage was over, and the questions didn't matter anymore. Or so I thought. On Monday, I went back to work. I sat at my desk, pretending to review reports I couldn't focus on when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in months. It said, "Can we talk? It's about Ethan." And it was from Margaret, Ethan's mother. She'd been more than a mother-in-law to me. She'd been a friend and a confidante, and the kind of woman who made you feel like you'd always been part of the family. She used to call just to check in and ask about work and tell me about her garden. She used to make me feel like I belonged, like I was truly part of something. And I'd assumed she hated me now. I'd assumed she'd taken Ethan's side the way any mother would. And I didn't blame her for that. I blamed myself for giving her a reason to choose, but I stared at the message for a long time, and part of me wanted to ignore it, and part of me was too ashamed to face her. But another part of me, a desperate and needy part, wanted to hear a familiar voice and wanted to feel even for a moment like I wasn't entirely alone. So I wrote back okay and asked where. We met at a small cafe halfway between our houses, a place we'd been to a dozen times over the years, always for easy, comfortable conversations. But this time was different. I arrived early and ordered a coffee I didn't drink and watched the door with my heart in my throat. And Margaret walked in 20 minutes later, looking older than I remembered, not in years, but in something heavier. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a weight for too long without setting it down. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands trembled slightly as she sat down across from me. and she said, "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." And I said, "Margaret, I know you probably hate me." But she stopped me and held up her hand and said, "I don't hate you, Rachel. I never hated you. I've been angry, yes, and disappointed and hurt, but I've never hated you. And I need you to understand something. Something I should have told you years ago." I felt my stomach tighten and asked, "What do you mean?" And she took a slow breath, the kind you take before delivering news you know will change everything. And she looked down at her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, with her knuckles pale from the grip. And she said, "Rachel, when you and Ethan were first dating, when you were engaged, I knew something about Ethan that I thought he would eventually tell you, but he didn't. And I convinced myself it wasn't my place to speak up. I convinced myself that he'd come around and that he'd find the courage. And now it's too late for that." And I asked, "What are you talking about?" And she reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a worn photograph and slid it across the table toward me. And I picked it up with fingers that were trembling almost as much as hers. It was a picture of Ethan, younger, maybe 22, standing next to a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful with dark hair and warm eyes and a smile that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets, and they were standing in front of a house I didn't recognize with his arm around her shoulder. And both of them were looking at the camera like they had the whole world ahead of them. And I asked, "Who is this?" My voice barely above a whisper, and Margaret's eyes glistened, and she said her name was Clara. She was Ethan's first love. They were together for 5 years. She was the first person he ever truly opened up to, and the first person he ever let see the parts of himself he kept hidden from everyone else. And I felt a cold knot forming in my chest, and I asked what happened to her, and Margaret took another slow breath and said she died. "Rachel, 2 years before you met Ethan, she died in a car accident, and Ethan never got over it. He never processed it. He just shut down. He buried all those feelings so deep inside himself that I don't think he even knew they were there anymore." I stared at the photograph, at the smiling face of a woman I'd never met, at the arm of the man I'd married wrapped around her shoulder like she was the center of his world. And I said, "He never told me." The words hollow. "We were together for 6 years, and we were married for 6 years, and he never—" And Margaret cut me off and said, "Of course he didn't. That's the thing about Ethan. He doesn't let people in. He never has." When Clara died, something in him broke in a way that never fully healed. He built walls around himself to keep from feeling that kind of pain again. And when he met you, I think he wanted to let you in. I really do. But he didn't know how, and I set the photograph down on the table with my hands shaking and tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. And I asked, "Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you tell me before? If I'd known—" But Margaret interrupted me with a sharp voice and said, "If you'd known what? If you'd known that your husband was carrying a wound so deep it made him incapable of true intimacy, would that have made you more patient with him and more understanding? Or would it have just been another reason for you to feel sorry for yourself?" Her words hit me like a slap, and I opened my mouth to defend myself, but nothing came out because she was right. She was absolutely right. And she continued in a softer voice saying, "I'm not saying this to hurt you, Rachel. I'm saying it because I've watched my son destroy himself for years. I watched him push you away bit by bit, and I watched you blame yourself for something that was never your fault. And then I watched you make a terrible choice because you felt abandoned. I'm not excusing what you did, and I'm not saying you weren't wrong. But I need you to understand that the man you married was already broken long before you ever came into his life." And I sat there in silence with the photograph still on the table between us and Clara's face, staring up at me, young and full of life, and I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't explain because she'd been gone for years, and yet she'd been a presence in my marriage the whole time, a ghost and a secret and a wound that Ethan had carried silently, never sharing and never healing. I finally said he didn't love me, not the way he loved her. I was just there, someone to fill a space and someone to make him feel less alone, even though he was never really with me. But Margaret shook her head slowly, with tears spilling down her cheeks, and said, "That's not true, Rachel. Ethan did love you. He just didn't know how to show it. He didn't know how to let you in because he'd never learned how to let anyone in since Clara. He was terrified of losing you the way he lost her, and so he held you at arm's length, thinking it would protect him and protect you. And I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake, wondering what was wrong with me, all the times I'd tried to reach him and found only silence, all the years I'd spent believing I wasn't enough, and now I understood that it had never been about me. It had always been about him, about the ghost of a woman he'd never stopped loving and the fear that had been eating him alive for years. And I asked, "Why are you telling me this, Margaret?" My voice breaking and cracking in a way I couldn't control. Why now? It's over. The divorce is final. There's nothing I can do to change what happened. And Margaret reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady in a way I hadn't expected. And she said, "Because you deserve to know, Rachel, you deserve to know that the collapse of your marriage wasn't entirely your fault. You made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but you were never the only one who failed. Ethan failed you too. He failed you from the very beginning by not being honest with you about who he really was." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my new apartment, replaying every moment of my marriage in my head, all the conversations I'd tried to have, and all the walls I'd tried to break through, and all the times I'd felt like I was talking to a stranger who wore my husband's face. And I realized with a clarity that was almost painful that I'd never known Ethan. Not really. I'd known the version of him he'd chosen to show me, the steady, quiet architect who built beautiful buildings and never let anyone see the cracks in his foundation. But I'd never known the real him, the one who'd lost his first love and never recovered, the one who was so terrified of being hurt again that he'd locked himself away in a fortress of silence and distance. And I'd blamed myself for his distance. I'd told myself I wasn't pretty enough and smart enough and good enough. I'd tried so hard to earn his love and break through his walls and make him see me. And when I'd finally given up and finally turned to someone else for the validation I wasn't getting at home, I'd become the villain of our story. But now I understood that there were no villains here, just two broken people, each carrying their own wounds, each too afraid to show the other the truth. I thought about Clara, about the way Ethan must have felt when he lost her, about the grief he'd been carrying for so many years, about the weight of that grief and the way it must have pressed down on him every single day, about how hard it must have been to love someone else after losing the person who was supposed to be your forever. And I didn't excuse what I'd done. I would never excuse what I'd done. But I understood it better. I understood why I'd made the choices I'd made. I'd been drowning, and I'd reached for anything that might keep me afloat. It didn't make it right, but it made it human. And the next few days were a blur. I went through the motions of my life, work and errands, and the hollow routines that had once given me comfort. But my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about Clara and about the life Ethan had lived before me and about the woman who'd shaped him into the man I'd married. And the tragedy that had broken him. I started researching. I looked up old articles about the accident and pieced together the timeline of Clara's death. I found a memorial page online filled with comments from friends and family, all of them talking about how bright she'd been and how full of life and how much she'd been loved. I read every single comment, trying to understand who she was and trying to understand what Ethan had lost. And the more I read, the more I understood that Clara wasn't just a ghost. She was a person, a real person who'd loved Ethan and been loved by him. A person who'd been taken too soon, leaving behind a wound that never quite healed. A person whose memory had shaped everything that came after. And I thought about what Margaret had said about him building walls around himself to keep from feeling that kind of pain again. And I understood that now. I understood why Ethan had been so distant and so guarded. He'd been protecting himself from the possibility of losing someone else he loved. I wondered if he'd ever told Clara about his fears and his secrets and the parts of himself he kept hidden from everyone else. I wondered if she'd been the one person who truly knew him. The one person who'd seen all of him and loved him anyway. And I wondered if losing her had made him incapable of ever letting anyone else get that close. But I also wondered if that was fair, if it was fair to me to build a marriage on a foundation of secrets. If it was fair to let me believe I was the problem when really he was the one who'd never healed. if it was fair to let me carry the weight of our failure alone. And I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure I ever would. I called Ethan the next day. It was the first time I'd reached out to him since the divorce was finalized, and I felt my hands shaking as I dialed his number. He answered on the fourth ring, with his voice guarded in that familiar way I'd grown to recognize over the years. And he said, "Rachel, is everything okay?" And I said, "Your mother came to see me. She told me about Clara. She told me everything." And there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing slow and uneven, like he was trying to steady himself, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said she shouldn't have done that. That wasn't her story to tell. And I said, "Neither was the way you treated me, Ethan." My voice coming out steadier than I expected. "You pushed me away, and you made me feel invisible. And you made me feel like I was the problem when all along you were the one carrying secrets you refused to share. And he said I was trying to protect you," his voice cracking on the last word. "I was trying to protect us. I didn't want you to see how broken I was, and I didn't want you to think you'd made a mistake by marrying me." I said instead, "You made me feel like I'd made a mistake by existing. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough, and like I didn't matter. And I made terrible choices because of that. Terrible choices that I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand, Ethan, that I wasn't the only one who failed. You failed too. You failed from the very beginning." And I heard him exhale slowly and shakily, and when he spoke again, his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, weaker, as if something inside him had finally permanently given way. And he whispered, I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it, for pushing you away and for keeping secrets, and for making you feel like you were never enough. You didn't deserve any of that, Rachel. You deserved better." And I closed my eyes with tears streaming down my cheeks, hot and unstoppable, and I pressed the phone tighter against my ear as if I could somehow bridge the distance between us. And I said, "I'm sorry too, Ethan. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry for betraying you, and I'm sorry for not being strong enough to find a different way. But I need you to know that if I'd known about Clara and if I'd understood why you were the way you were, I might have done things differently. I might have been more patient, and I might have fought harder for us." There was another long silence, and when Ethan spoke, his voice was hoarse and raw in a way I'd never heard before. He said, "I should have told you. I should have told you about her and about everything. I was just so scared, Rachel. I was so scared of losing you, and in the end I lost you anyway." And we talked for almost an hour after that, not as ex-lovers, but as two people trying to make sense of something that had fallen apart. We talked about Clara and about the accident, and about the grief Ethan had been carrying for so many years. We talked about our marriage and all the ways we'd failed each other. We talked about forgiveness, not as an easy answer, but as something we might someday be able to work toward. And when I finally hung up the phone, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because anything was fixed, because nothing was fixed, but because I finally understood that the end of my marriage wasn't solely my fault. It was a collapse of two people, each carrying their own secrets, each too afraid to show the other the truth. The weeks after my conversation with Ethan were strange. We didn't talk often, once maybe twice a week, with brief calls that felt like tentative steps toward something neither of us could name. But when we did talk, it was different than before. There was no anger and no blame, just two people trying to understand each other and trying to make sense of the wreckage they'd left behind. And Ethan told me more about Clara. He told me about the day they met on a rainy afternoon at a coffee shop where she'd spilled her drink all over his notebook. He told me about the first time he told her he loved her and how terrified he'd been, and how she'd just smiled and kissed him like it was the most natural thing in the world. He told me about the night she died and how he'd gotten the call in the middle of the night and how he'd driven to the hospital and found her already gone. And he cried when he told me that part. I'd never heard Ethan cry before, not in all the years we were married. He'd always been so composed and so controlled, and never letting his emotions show. But now on the phone in the quiet of my apartment, he let himself break down. He said, I was so angry at the world and at God and at everyone. I couldn't understand why she'd been taken. She was so young and so full of life, and she had so much to live for. And then she was just gone, and I was left to figure out how to keep going without her. And I said, I can't imagine what that must have been like. And he said, nobody can. Not really. You can try to understand. Unless you've to understand, but unless you've been through it, you can't fully comprehend what it does to you. It hollows you out, Rachel. It takes everything you thought you knew about yourself and leaves you with nothing but questions. And I thought about my own grief. The grief I'd felt when our marriage started falling apart, and when I'd realized that the man I loved was slipping away from me. And it was nothing compared to what Ethan had been through. Nothing compared to losing the person you'd planned to spend your life with. And he said, I should have told you about Clara and about everything. I was so scared that if I opened up and if I let you see the worst parts of me, you'd leave, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing another person I loved. I said, I don't think I would have left. I think I would have understood, and I think I would have been patient with you. I think we could have built something real and something honest if you'd just trusted me enough to let me in. And he said, I know that now, but I didn't know it then. I was too scared to take the risk, and we were both quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow and steady, and I felt a strange sense of peace because we were finally being honest with each other and finally saying the things we'd been too afraid to say for years. And I said, maybe that's what we should have done from the beginning. Maybe we should have started with the truth instead of waiting until it was too late. And he said, maybe, but we can't go back. We can only go forward. I started seeing a therapist again. Dr. Patterson, the woman I'd seen during the divorce, was still practicing, and she agreed to take me back. And the sessions were harder than before in some ways, but they were also healing. And during one of our sessions, she said, you've been carrying a lot of guilt. Guilt about the affair and guilt about the divorce and guilt about the choices you made. And that guilt is weighing you down. And I said, I know. I just can't stop feeling it. I hurt someone I loved, and I broke my vows, and I destroyed our marriage. How am I supposed to forgive myself for that? And she said, you're supposed to forgive yourself the same way you'd forgive anyone else. Collapse. By acknowledging that you made the best you could with the information you had at the time, and that you've learned from it. And I said I didn't have all the information. I didn't know about Clara, and I didn't know about the grief Ethan was carrying, if I'd known. And she said, if you'd known, things might have been different, but you didn't know, and you can't change the past. All you can do is move forward carrying the lessons you've learned with you. I thought about that. A lot about the lessons I'd learned. I'd learned that secrets are toxic and that they eat away at relationships from the inside. I'd learned that love requires vulnerability and that you can't truly connect with someone unless you're willing to let them see the worst parts of you. I'd learned that forgiveness isn't just something you give to others, it's something you have to give to yourself. And I thought about Ethan and about the secrets he'd kept and the walls he'd built. I understood them better now, even if I didn't agree with them. He'd been so terrified of being hurt that he'd made himself incapable of real intimacy. And I'd been so desperate for validation that I'd betrayed the person I loved most. We were both broken, and we were both flawed, and we were both just trying to survive the best way we knew how. Margaret and I kept in touch after that day at the cafe. We didn't talk often, but we'd text occasionally and check in on each other. She'd ask how I was doing, and I'd ask about Ethan. It was strange keeping a relationship with my former mother-in-law, but it also felt right because she'd been a part of my life for so long that I couldn't imagine just cutting her out. And she told me once over the phone that I deserve to be happy. Rachel, I know you made mistakes, and we all make mistakes, but you're a good person and you deserve to find peace. And I said, I don't know if I'll ever find peace, but I'm trying. That's all I can do. And she said, trying is enough. Trying is always enough. A year passed, and then two. The divorce faded into the background, becoming a scar rather than an open wound. I still thought about Ethan sometimes and about what might have been if we'd been honest with each other from the beginning, but I also thought about my own healing and my own growth and the person I'd become, and I started dating again. Slowly at first and cautiously with the kind of fear that only comes from having been burned before, and I met a man named Alex through a mutual friend. He was quiet and kind with a gentle smile and a way of making you feel safe. He was an artist, a painter who worked out of a small studio downtown, And he had the kind of creative mind that made every conversation an adventure. We started slowly, coffee dates that turned into long walks in the park and dinner dates that stretched late into the night. He wasn't like Ethan. He was open and expressive and unafraid to show his emotions. He told me about his childhood and his parents' divorce and his struggles with anxiety. He didn't hide from me. He let me see all of him, and he asked me to do the same. And I told him about my past, about my marriage to Ethan, and about the affair, and about the secrets we'd both kept and the wounds we'd both carried. I told him about Clara and about the grief that had shaped so much of Ethan's life. And I told him about myself, about the loneliness I'd felt, and the desperate need to be seen, and the terrible choices I'd made when I didn't feel seen. And he listened. He didn't judge. He just listened. He said, I think everyone deserves a second chance. Not with the same person necessarily, but with themselves. You made mistakes, Rachel, but you've also learned from them. And that's what matters. And I said, are you sure you want to be with someone like me? Someone who's done the things I've done? And he smiled and said, I'm sure, because I'm not looking for a perfect person. I'm looking for someone real. Someone who's been through things and learned from them and come out the other side stronger. And that's what you are, Rachel. That's who you are. And I felt a warmth spread through my chest because it was such a simple thing, his words, but they meant more to me than I could express. He wasn't judging me for my past. He was accepting me for who I was, flaws and all. And that's when I realized what real love looks like. It's not about hiding your wounds. It's about finding someone who will help you heal them. I stayed in touch with Margaret. She was happy for me, genuinely happy, when she heard about Alex. She said, he sounds wonderful, and you deserve someone wonderful, Rachel. You really do. And I said, thank you, Margaret, for everything, for telling me the truth and for giving me the closure I needed. And she said, closure is a funny thing. It's not something you get from other people. It's something you give yourself. I just gave you the tools. You did the work. And she was right. The work had been mine. The healing and the growth and the forgiveness had all come from inside me. Margaret had given me the truth, and I'd done the rest. I think about that day in the cafe sometimes, the day Margaret said he never told you. I think about how those 4 words changed everything for me and how they shifted the entire narrative of my marriage and my life and who I thought I was. Because for years I'd believed I was the villain, the one who'd cheated and the one who'd destroyed her marriage and the one who'd been too weak to do the right thing. But Margaret's revelation changed all that. It didn't excuse what I'd done, and it didn't make it okay, but it helped me understand that I wasn't the only one who'd failed, and I wasn't the only one keeping secrets, and I wasn't the only one who'd been too afraid to be honest. I cheated on my husband and he divorced me, and then his mother said he never told you, and I finally understood that I was never the only one who was hiding. We'd both been hiding our fears and our wounds and our deepest truths. We'd built our marriage on a foundation of secrets, and when the foundation cracked, there was nothing left to hold it together. I don't blame Ethan anymore, and I don't blame myself. I just understand. Understand that we were both doing the best we could with what we had. Understand that sometimes love isn't enough. Understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go. And I think about Clara sometimes too, the woman who started it all. The woman whose ghost haunted our marriage without either of us realizing it. And I don't resent her. I feel something closer to gratitude because she taught Ethan how to love, and she showed him what was possible. And even though he lost her, and even though he closed himself off after she was gone, the capacity for that love was still there, buried but there. And I think about what it would have been like to meet Clara, to sit down with her over coffee and talk about the man we both loved. And I think she would have been kind, and I think she would have understood. And I think she would have wanted Ethan to be happy even if that happiness wasn't with her. And I hope she's at peace wherever she is. And I hope she knows that she was loved, and that her memory shaped a man's life in ways she couldn't have imagined. And I hope she knows that I don't blame her for any of this because she was just living her life, loving someone, and she was taken too soon. I'm sitting on my balcony as I write this. The sun is setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Alex is inside cooking dinner, humming a song I don't recognize. I can smell garlic and herbs drifting through the window, and I feel a sense of peace that I never thought I'd find again. I think about the years I spent feeling invisible and the years I spent blaming myself for something that was never entirely my fault, and the years I spent searching for validation in all the wrong places, and I realize how far I've come and how much I've grown and how much I've healed. It wasn't easy and it's never easy, but it was worth it. Every painful conversation and every tearful therapy session and every sleepless night staring at the ceiling was all worth it because it led me here to this moment, to this life. I still think about Ethan sometimes. I wonder if he's found peace, and I wonder if he's learned to let people in, and I wonder if he's happy. I hope he is. I really do. He deserves to be happy, and we both do. We text occasionally, Ethan and I. Brief exchanges about birthdays or holidays or mutual friends. Nothing deep and nothing heavy. Just a thread connecting us to the past and a reminder that we once meant something to each other, and I've forgiven him. And I've forgiven myself, and I've let go of the guilt and the shame and the what-ifs. I've accepted that I made mistakes and that I learned from them, and I've moved forward. If you've made it this far with me, I want to tell you something. Something I wish someone had told me years ago. The people you love are not always who you think they are. They carry secrets and wounds and fears they may never share with you, and sometimes those secrets can destroy everything you've built together. But that doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It just means it wasn't enough. Not because you failed, but because love alone can't save a relationship. Love requires honesty, and love requires vulnerability. And love requires the willingness to let someone see the worst parts of you and trust that they'll stay anyway. I cheated on my husband because I felt invisible, and he pushed me away because he was terrified of being hurt. Neither of us was wrong, and neither of us was right. We were just two broken people trying to survive the best way we knew how, and we failed each other in the process. But we also learned, and we grew, and we became better versions of ourselves, and that's what matters. That's the point. We don't get to undo the past, and we don't get to erase our mistakes, but we get to learn from them, and we get to grow, and we get to become people who are worthy of the love we once threw away. So if you're reading this, and if you're carrying guilt or shame or regret, know that you're not alone. Know that you can heal. Know that you deserve a second chance, not with the same person necessarily, but with yourself. I'm Rachel Park, and I cheated on my husband, and he divorced me, and then his mother said he never told you. And that question changed everything. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer, it's refusing to carry their lies any longer, and refusing to let their secrets define you, and standing up and saying, I am more than the worst thing I ever did. I am more than the marriage that failed. I am more than the person who made terrible choices. I don't know what happens next for me, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think happens to Rachel next. Do you think she ever lets someone new into her life, or do you think she's found everything she needs on her own? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love hearing from all of you. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.